Now that we have the ability to edit a movie and save a movie, it's time to take a quick look at validation, because currently the user can blank out the title and enter random characters for the release year, click save, and that data will be sent to the server. Now the server will do validation and not allow me to save a movie that doesn't have a title, but it would be nice if we also had some client-side validation. And there's a few different ways that you can do client-side validation. You can use HTML5 validation attributes. Attributes like required and min and max. Or you could use an existing JavaScript library like jQuery validation. But there's also another module that the Aurelia framework provides, and I wanted to give you a quick example of how it can work. What I want to do is JSPM install Aurelia validation. Once JSPM is finished installing Aurelia validation, all I need to do is some simple configuration in the bootstrapping of my application, and then import validation into my view models that need validation. So first, let's look at configuring this optional plugin. Back inside of the main module that we created in the last video module, I have my configure function that configures Aurelia for my application, and I want to tell Aurelia to use a plugin, Aurelia validation. We'll talk more about plugin in just a little bit, but all you need to know for now is that using this method .plugin, it's going to call into an entry point in Aurelia validation and allow Aurelia validation to configure its environment, much like I'm configuring my environment here. And this will allow Aurelia validation to do things like plug in new custom elements that I can use, custom elements that will help me perform validation on a form. And in order to do that validation, I'm going to need some validation rules. And to do that, I am going to import the validation symbol from Aurelia validation. And validation is another component. It's a class, it's a service that I want injected into this view model. So I will add validation to my inject attribute and then expect to receive a validation component as the third parameter in my constructor. And there's various ways to use this validation component, but let me show you one approach that uses a Fluent API to configure the validation rules here inside of the view model. So I am going to save off a field in this object called validation, and it will be the result of saying validation on this view model. What I want to do is ensure a few things about the title of a movie. I want to make sure it is not empty. And I want to make sure it has a minimum length of at least 3 characters and has a maximum length 100 characters or less. I also want to ensure that movie.releaseYear, that it is a number and that it is between, let's say, the year 1900 and 2100. So these are my validation rules. And like I say, this is one way to use the validation plugin. And there are quite a few built-in validations. There's also a lot of extensibility in this plugin. If I want to build my own validation functions or my own validation components, I can easily do that and have them work with this plugin. Just refer to the documentation for more information. But I now have this field in my view model called validation, and I can use that field to drive validation both programmatically here inside of my code, as well as associate this validation with a specific form that is in my markup so that I get the proper error messages onto the screen. And yes, the validation plugin does support some localization. Not all the languages are available yet, but it will be easy to provide some customized error messages. So first, let's take a look at using this validation component programmatically. Let's say that once I get movie data from the server, I want to run a quick validation just to make sure that the movie is in a good state. If that's the case, I can go to the validation field and I can tell it to run a validation. And if for some reason the movie comes back from the server in a bad state, the user will see some error messages on the screen about what needs to be fixed. Now in this particular case, I don't really care about the result of the validation. I just want to execute the validation and put those validation messages on the screen if they're required. But there are times where I also might want to know the result of a validation. For instance, when the user clicks the save button, I might want to run this validation and wait to see the result of the validation before I call into the save method of my movie data component. If that's what I want to do, then I'm going to have to program against the promise that validate returns. It returns a promise because some validations can be asynchronous. And if the promise resolves successfully, that means the validation was successful. If the promise is rejected, that means that validation failed. And what I will do is just take the code to save the movie and paste that inside of the then method so that we only send the movie to the server when we have valid data. I also want to come into my view and change a few things around for validation. First of all, I really want to associate validation with the submission of this form, not necessarily just the clicking of some arbitrary button that's inside of the form. So I'm not going to handle click.trigger inside of this button. In fact, I think I'm going to change this button into an input, type submit. That makes it more obvious that this is the button responsible for triggering a submission of the form. And I will just need to give this input a value so that it displays the text save. And now up here on the form, this is really where I want to handle the submit event. So submit.trigger equals invoke that save method on my view model. But one more thing I want to do is use a custom attribute that is provided by the Aurelia validation plugin and bind that attribute to the validation field that is on my view model. This will allow the coordination of everything that has to happen for proper form validation. And with that in place, let's refresh the application and see what we get. If I try to blank out the title of Star Wars, then I can see title is required. And when there's only a couple characters there, I can see that this needs to be at least 3 characters long. And of course, there's an obvious problem with the styling of these messages, but we'll talk about that in just a second. The release year, oddly enough, I did not make it required. I did not say that it should not be empty. But if something is there, it needs to be a number, and it needs to be a number between 1900 and 2100. Now, if you're wondering why these error messages appear a little bit oddly, why they break the layout of my form, that's just because by default, they will be placed into the DOM as block level elements, but fortunately, I can influence the layout if I just add a few of my own styles to the application. So let me create a style sheet. Let's call it styles. And inside of styles, I want to write a rule for the class Aurelia validation message. And what I want to do is make sure that these display as an inline element. I'm also going to tweak the margin on the left. Let's make it 5 pixels. And the margin on the top, let's make it 5 pixels. Save this. I'm also going to have to make sure that that style sheet is included onto the page for my application. So inside of index.html, let's have a link for a style sheet, and the href for that is simply styles.css. So save all this again, let's refresh, and let's break a validation rule, and I can see that a little more tweaking might be required, but I do have some client-side validation occurring. And it's also really easy to disable the save button when the form is not in a valid state. Let's go to that input, and I want to say disabled. Let's bind to this, so an expression. I want this to be disabled when validation result is not valid. So not validation.result.isValid. Save this again, refresh one more time, and let me blank out the title. And you can see the save button gets grayed out. I can no longer click on it. Enter in a valid title. I would now be able to click on that save button. So this is a quick example of one approach to form validation with Aurelia. And what I want to focus on for the rest of this module is actually the topic of plugins and how something like Aurelia-validation can plug into the Aurelia framework and provide new components like custom attributes and custom elements.